According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, more than 1 in 4 Americans have some form of disability as of 2024. Though this is a recent statistic, people with disabilities have always existed. However, they have not always been accepted as equals in the population. In the 20th century, many children with disabilities were sent away to institutions as their communities did not have the proper resources and support systems to accommodate their needs. One such institution was Willowbrook State School, opened in Staten Island, New York, in 1948. Although this institution was meant to be a safe facility providing resources, therapy, and opportunities for children with disabilities, it was anything but that. An exposé by Geraldo Rivera revealed the horrid conditions the residents endured. The children would be covered in their own feces, exposed to illnesses, and would be left to themselves with no access to education or therapies. This institution highlighted the lack of support and resources that people with disabilities had, resulting in them being dehumanized and treated like animals. It was one of many events that led to the protests for equal rights for people with disabilities. April 5, 1977 marks the start of Section 504 sit-ins around the United States. Section 504 refers to the portion of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 that defines civil rights for people with disabilities that had still not been signed into law at this time. The longest of these sit-ins lasted 26 days in San Francisco, California. They were joined by sit-ins in Washington, D.C., Seattle, Los Angeles, Denver, Chicago, Dallas, Atlanta, New York City, Boston, and Philadelphia. San Francisco was the only protest location that lasted beyond the first few days. These weren't just any random locations. The protesters specifically chose the Health, Education, and Welfare offices because its secretary, Joseph A. Califano, had been collaborating with lobbyists that wanted to eliminate 504 regulations, making it harder for people with disabilities to get jobs and access public education. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973 required employers to utilize affirmative action to employ individuals with disabilities and prevented the discrimination of individuals due to their disability. Section 504 was the first federal law that recognized disability as a civil rights category. No otherwise qualified individual with a disability in the United States, as defined in Section 705 of this title, shall solely by reason of his or her disability be excluded from the participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. While Section 504 states that reasonable accommodations need to be made, it does not specify what kind of accommodations are reasonable or a way to enforce them. These regulations were developed under the Ford administration, but the issue came when they were never actually published. The signing off to approve the publication of the regulations was charged to President Carter's Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, Joseph A. Califano, who was being discouraged from publishing it by schools and hospitals. These such organizations did not want to spend the money to follow the regulations and make the required accommodations. It was the goal of the 504 sit-in protest to pressure Califano to publish these regulations, making them enforceable and required by all federal institutions and organizations. In the present day, Section 504 requires the implementation of ways to access federal buildings, such as curb cuts, handrails, ramps, and access to public schools, and other language options like American Sign Language and Braille.
2,000 years later.
In 1977, disabled Americans had been waiting several years for the protections promised under Section 504 and were rightly frustrated at being pushed aside time and time again. The American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities had proof that Califano and lobbyists were attempting to weaken Section 504 regulations before it was published or prevent the publication of Section 504 entirely, thus attempting to reduce the impact and measures it would require the dissenting organizations to take, saving these organizations money. The ACCD called for Califano to either publish the unaltered Section 504 regulations by April of 1977 or step down. When April came and neither demand was met, the sit-ins started at the regional offices of the Health, Education, and Welfare Department to protest Califano directly. Although the other 9 protests had ended, the sit-in in San Francisco had been going strong for several days. Inside the building, protesters organized to cover their needs of food, hygiene, and medical needs, as well as publicity to keep the protest going strong. Leaders rose, those like Judy Heumann, who sued the state of New York to be the first disabled person to hold a teaching license and was politically active ever since. Heumann managed the basic needs of protesters, or those like Kitty Cohn and Dennis Billups, who had initially only been protesters, but rose to the occasion and managed logistics and morale. In opposition to the protest, police cut off phone lines and hot water to the Health, Education, and Welfare office building that protesters were occupying in order to put pressure on them to end the sit-in early as all the other protests across the country had. Instead, protesters relied on the skills and support of their members both inside and outside of the building. Cohn managed internal logistics and fashioned a refrigerator out of an AC unit to keep medications cold. Those fluent in American Sign Language communicated with supporters outside of the office building to communicate with the changing needs and situation. Disability does not exist in isolation. Disability affects all types of people, and as such, the Section 504 sit-in had all sorts of groups support their efforts. These include the Black Panthers and Brick Hut Lesbian Cooperative, who helped provide food to the protesters in the Health, Education, and Welfare building. During the sit-in, some protesters traveled, including Judy Heumann and Dennis Billups, to Washington, D.C. to meet with President Jimmy Carter to discuss the 504 regulations. Many of the protesters were unable to travel around D.C. due to lack of accommodations, so the International Association of Machinists had to rent out a moving truck to help transport those with wheelchairs. President Carter and Califano refused to meet with the protesters. It was not until the media became involved, bringing attention to the protest and showing Carter slipping out back doors of buildings to avoid the protesters, that Califano finally signed to publish the 504 regulations. In 1990, Congress borrowed from Section 504, or the Rehabilitation Act, to create the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, to expand the coverage of disabled individuals because it prohibits both public and private institutions from discriminating against disabled individuals. The 3 acts within the ADA cover private and public discrimination. 1. Relates to private employment. 2. Prohibits discrimination within public entities like public school systems. And 3. Addresses public accommodations. Universities receiving federal funding must comply to both Section 504 and the ADA. However, since UNC is a historical university, there are different rules and regulations the ADA allows for it, so it can still be complicit within the rules. There is a minimum UNC must follow to make the campus accessible, but what it really does is meet the bare minimum. With the many new and previous renovations on campus, the university has been gunning to meet the minimum ADA regulations as well as make the building more up to code. However, though the improvements are meant well, sometimes it creates more barriers for students. There are sites available to report issues to the campus, but it takes some time to be adjusted. UNC provides accessible rooms that aim to provide flashing lights and a louder fire alarm for those that have hearing loss and have handrails and design implications for those who are wheelchair-bound or have mobility issues. Like previously mentioned, these rooms are intended well, but they often fall flat with those needing it. Other accommodations like elevator access are often not always guaranteed, and students are trapped with no other resources. Students miss classes due to elevator failures and lack of access to accessible restrooms. In 2022, Laura Saavedra, a student who is a wheelchair user, was stranded on the 4th floor in Corey, a residence hall, for days. Paramedics had to help her down the stairs so she could make a doctor's appointment. She continued to face accessibility problems with the school, especially in the face of fire alarms or drills. She was instructed to wait by the stairs and told she would receive help. Instead, she was told that it was not a serious fire alarm, so she could go back to her room. In another instance, she was told to use the elevator, despite the sign that no person should use the elevator in an instance of a fire alarm. In response to this, Saavedra said that she has told university staff that she refuses to live in a non-ground floor room. However, she got responses from the university that they just don't have the rooms, capacity, or accommodations, or that some dorms aren't accessible because they're historic. Overall, UNC did not comment on what happened but provided the same copy-paste answer, proving where or how they provide accessible options while also not taking accountability or reflecting on if these are actually accessible or not. A year later, UNC students protested for 32 hours on the steps of South Building in reflection of how long freshman Laura Saavedra was trapped in her dorm room. Even though no change directly resulted from this event, it was reported that it was the catalyst for students with disabilities to be able to voice their concerns to university administration. Most notably after this protest, the old well was renovated to be more accessible to all by adding the ramp at the back so those not able to navigate stairs could be photographed underneath the well covering. Previous Chancellor Kevin G. stated after the reopening, the old well is one of the most photographed icons in our state. It brings our community together every day, and especially tomorrow when we celebrate FDoc and our tradition of the first sip. Yet for decades, it hasn't been truly accessible to every member of our community. That changes today, and I am so grateful to the many people who work together to make this possible. All around, UNC does good things with accessible areas, but they have major issues. It is a constant battle for people needing accommodations to get proper access with the school even though they follow 504 and ADA regulations.